There is a category of mistake that successful men make in the specific window of time between their first major success and the moment when the world provides them with an honest correction. The window varies in length depending on the man and the circumstances surrounding him and the particular combination of institutional support and personal mythology that the success has generated. For some men, the window is short because the world they operate in contains enough friction to interrupt the mythology before it calcifies into something the man cannot revise without dismantling a significant portion of his identity along with it. For other men, the window extends across years because the environment around them has been organized, not maliciously but systematically, to remove the friction that would otherwise interrupt the mythology in its formative stages. The longer the window stays open, the more expensive the correction becomes when it finally arrives, because the correction has to work against not just the original mistake, but against all the subsequent decisions the man has made on the basis of the original mistake being true. Steven Seagal's window had been open for approximately 4 years by the autumn of 1992 snorts. 4 years of consecutive box office success. 4 years of a studio apparatus reinforcing the narrative. 4 years of training partners pulling strikes and publicists crafting statements and directors shaping coverage, and the entire professional machinery of Hollywood doing what it does for the men it has decided to invest in, which is to construct around them an environment in which the gap between what they believe about themselves and what is actually true about them is never made visible in any way that requires them to do anything about it. The Tonight Show with Jay Leno had been on the air for less than a year when the booking was made. It was still finding its footing in the specific way that successor programs find their footing when they are operating in the shadow of a long and beloved predecessor. The production team had booked 2 guests for the Tuesday evening taping in November of 1992, whose names occupied adjacent spaces in the cultural conversation about martial arts and action cinema, and had booked them with the professional optimism of a television production that understood the booking to be potentially interesting without anticipating the specific form the interest would take. They had booked Steven Seagal, and they had booked Chuck Norris, and they had not fully accounted for what the green room produces when you place those 2 men in it at the same time. The Tonight Show green room at NBC Burbank in 1992 was a functional space that had hosted enough famous people across enough decades that it had developed the specific quality of rooms that have been used for important things for a long time, which is the quality of absolute indifference to whoever currently occupies it. The furniture was good and comfortable and completely impersonal. The catering was professional and plentiful, and arranged with the practiced anonymity of food that has been selected to offend nobody and delight nobody, and sustain everybody through the specific pre-performance anxiety that precedes a live television appearance. The walls held framed photographs of previous guests that communicated the history of the program without communicating anything about the specific people currently in the room. It was a space designed to contain famous people without being changed by them, and it had been succeeding at this function for longer than most of the people who passed through it had been alive. Clear's throat, Chuck arrived first. He arrived 40 minutes before the taping was scheduled to begin, which was his consistent practice in any professional context that had a scheduled start time, because he had been taught by people he respected early in his career that arriving early was a form of respect for the people responsible for the environment, and that the respect cost nothing and communicated something specific about the man who paid it. He was wearing dark slacks and a plain white dress shirt open at the collar, and the kind of sport coat that a man wears when he wants to look appropriate for a television appearance without looking like he spent time thinking about what to wear for a television appearance. He shook hands with the production assistant who met him at the door. He accepted a cup of coffee. He sat in one of the comfortable chairs near the monitor that was showing the pre-show run-through on the studio floor below, and watched it with the calm, patient attention of a man who has no anxiety about what is coming, and therefore no need to perform the management of anxiety. He was 52 years old that autumn. Walker, Texas Ranger was in its first season. His face was the face that 3 decades of public life had built on the foundation of the face he had started with, which was a face that communicated something specific and consistent, regardless of what expression it was wearing, and what it communicated was the quality of a man who had been honestly tested many times across many years, and had arrived at a settled knowledge of himself that did not require external confirmation to remain stable. Snorts. Seagal arrived 22 minutes before the taping. He arrived the way he arrived most places in 1992, with 2 people around him whose function was partly logistical and partly atmospheric, in the way that certain kinds of famous people require an atmosphere to be established around them before they enter a room so that the room receives them as significant, rather than requiring them to establish their own significance through the normal social mechanisms that less famous people use. He was wearing a black ensemble that the entertainment press of that era would have described as his signature look, which it was in the sense that it had been selected and maintained as a visual statement about the person inside it, and had been successful enough at making the statement that he had continued making it across several years of public appearances. He was 40 years old. Out for Justice had been released the previous year. Under Siege was in post-production and was tracking well with test audiences, and was going to extend his commercial run in a way that the studio had been anticipating since Principal Photography wrapped. Everything in his professional life was telling him the same story in the autumn of 1992, which was the story of a man at the peak of his particular cultural moment with no visible reason to expect the peak to end. Clear's throat. He walked into the green room and saw Chuck Norris sitting in the chair near the monitor with a cup of coffee and the particular quality of settled stillness that Chuck brought to every room he occupied. Something moved in Seagal's face in the moment of recognition. Not dramatically, not in a way that the production assistant in the room would have identified as significant, but the people who knew Seagal well enough to read the small movements of his face would have recognized it as the specific movement that his face made when something had activated the part of him that kept score. The two men had met before. Not many times and not in circumstances that had produced anything resembling warmth between them, but enough times that the recognition was mutual and immediate, and carried the specific weight of a history that had not been resolved into anything comfortable. They had been in the same rooms at the same industry events. They had been mentioned in the same articles in the same publications, in the same comparative contexts that the entertainment press uses when it is trying to organize a cultural moment into a hierarchy. And the hierarchy those articles tended to produce had not consistently placed Seagal where Seagal believed the hierarchy should place him. Snorts. He greeted Chuck with the practiced warmth of a man who has learned that the opening of a social exchange should never reveal the purpose of the exchange before the purpose has been established on ground of the opener's choosing. He said something appreciative about Walker, Texas Ranger. He said it with the specific calibration that compliments carry when they are being used as instruments rather than expressions. The calibration of a man who is saying something positive in order to establish a conversational position from which something less positive can be said without appearing to be what it is. Chuck thanked him. He said something brief and genuine about the show and returned his attention to the coffee cup in his hand in the quiet way that ends a conversational opening without inviting its continuation. The production assistant, who was the only other person in the green room at that moment, said later that in the 60 seconds after Seagal walked in and before the conversation began in earnest, she had the specific feeling that the room had changed in a way she could not account for through any of the normal variables of two additional people arriving and sitting down. That the change was qualitative rather than quantitative, and that it was produced by something between the two men that she did not have enough context to name, but that she recognized as the kind of thing that rooms recognize before people do. Clear's throat. The conversation developed the way conversations develop in green rooms before live television appearances, which is with the surface pleasantry of professional people managing their pre-performance energy through social exchange, while the actual content of the exchange moves along a different track beneath the surface pleasantry. They talked about the industry. They talked about the action genre and where it was going and what the audience wanted from it and the ways in which the international market was changing the commercial calculus of what studios were willing to greenlight. These were the normal topics of the professional conversation between two men who occupied the same corner of the same industry and who had a business reason to stay current on the same information. For approximately 10 minutes the conversation stayed on that surface and produced nothing that either man would have had any difficulty repeating verbatim in any context. Snorts. Then Seagal shifted. He shifted in the way that men shift when they have been patient with the surface long enough and have decided that the purpose of the exchange has waited long enough to be served. He began talking about martial arts, about the evolution of combat systems, and the distinction between traditional tournament-based arts and the more comprehensive systems that had been developed in response to genuine fighting requirements rather than competitive ones. He said these things in the conversational tone of a man sharing observations rather than advancing an argument, but the observations were arranged in a specific sequence that pointed consistently in one direction, which was the direction of a conclusion that he had not yet stated, but that was becoming visible in the architecture of the observations, the way a destination becomes visible in the architecture of a road before the sign announcing it appears. Chuck listened. He drank his coffee. His expression did not change in any way that Seagal could have used as a reading of how the observations were landing. Clear's throat, a second production assistant came into the green room with a schedule update. 45 minutes to taping, she left. The door closed. Seagal continued. He said that the martial arts world had produced in the previous 20 years a generation of practitioners whose credentials were built on the tournament circuit, and whose reputations therefore reflected a specific and limited kind of testing, the kind that occurred inside a rule structure and a time limit, and a referee's authority to stop the exchange at the point where real consequences would otherwise begin to accumulate. He said that this kind of testing produced real skill, but produced it in a container that was narrow enough that the skill did not necessarily translate outside the container. He said that what genuinely comprehensive martial arts training looked like was different from what tournament training looked like, and that the difference was not always visible from the outside, but was always visible from the inside, to the man who had the comprehensive training and who had therefore encountered the boundary conditions where the tournament-based system stopped functioning. Snorts. He said all of this without naming Chuck directly. He said it in the careful way that men say things they intend to be understood as directed at a specific person while maintaining the formal position that they are speaking generally. Chuck understood the direction. He had been understanding this kind of direction for 30 years and had developed an accurate and unsentimental capacity for reading it, regardless of the formal position the speaker was maintaining. He set his coffee cup down on the table next to his chair. He looked at Seagal with the open, settled expression that the people who knew him would have recognized as the expression of a man who has finished the patient part of a conversation and has arrived at the part that requires something different. He said that he appreciated the perspective. He said it without irony. He said that the question of what different training environments produced in practitioners was a genuinely interesting question and one that he had thought about across 30 years of being inside the practice. He said that in his experience, the most reliable way to answer questions of that kind was not through the conversation about the question, but through the direct encounter with the question in conditions that permitted a real answer to emerge. He said this in the calm, even tone of a man making an observation rather than issuing a challenge, but the observation had the specific quality of observations that function as invitations. And the invitation was clear enough that the production assistant who had come back into the green room with a wardrobe question and then stopped in the doorway when she registered the quality of what she had walked into, stood very still in the doorway without completing her entrance or retreating from it. Clear's throat. Seagal received the invitation. He received it the way he received most things in the autumn of 1992, which was with the confidence of a man who has not been honestly answered in long enough that the confidence has become structural rather than situational. He said that he was happy to explore the question directly. He said it with the practiced smile. He gestured toward the open section of the green room floor between the furniture groupings, an area perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet of carpeted TV studio floor that was not designed for any purpose remotely related to what was now being proposed for it, but that was available and unoccupied and sufficient for the immediate requirement. Chuck stood up. He set the coffee cup on the table with the final definitive placement of a man who is done with the coffee and is moving to the next thing. He removed the sport coat and folded it once and placed it on the arm of the chair. Underneath, he was wearing the plain white dress shirt. He kept the slacks. He kept the dress shoes. He walked to the center of the open section of the green room floor and stood with his hands loose at his sides and his weight distributed evenly, and his eyes on Seagal with the specific open quality of attention that he brought to the beginning of any genuine exchange, which was the attention of a man who had learned that the most useful thing at the start was to see what was actually in front of him, rather than what he had decided was going to be in front of him. Snorts. The production assistant in the doorway did not move. She would say later that she had made a calculation in the moment about whether her professional responsibilities required her to intervene in what was developing, and had concluded that the calculation was not close, and that the correct answer was to remain in the doorway and observe and ensure that someone with knowledge of the situation was present in the room. Seagal positioned himself across the open section from Chuck. He settled into the Aikido-ready position that 12 years of daily training in Japan had built into his body as completely as any physical pattern can be built into a body, which is to say that it was not something he assumed so much as something he became when the situation activated it, hands open at chest height. Weight balanced at center, the posture of a system designed to receive force and redirect it, and use the attacker's own commitment against the structure that produced it. He had been in this posture 10,000 times in training environments across 15 years of serious practice. It had worked 10,000 times. The information available to him in the green room of The Tonight Show in November of 1992 did not include anything that would have given him a reason to expect the 10,000, and first time to produce a different result. "Clears throat," he initiated. He stepped forward and reached for Chuck's lead wrist with his right hand, the foundational entry of Aikido, the grip that preceded the lock that preceded the throw that resolved the encounter. It was the opening he had used to begin 10,000 training exchanges, and it had established contact 10,000 times. Chuck's wrist moved 3 inches to the outside of Seagal's closing fingers in a rotation of the forearm so compact that the production assistant in the doorway did not register it as a defensive action until she processed the fact that Seagal's hand had closed on nothing. The wrist had been there, and then it had not been there, and the transition between the two states had occurred in less time than her visual system had required to track it. Seagal's hand came back. He reset. The information arriving in his system was the information that a missed entry always carries, which is the information that the foundational assumption of the system, which is that the entry can be established, has just been tested against a specific opponent and has returned a result that the system did not anticipate. Snorts. In the same motion that removed the wrist, Chuck had thrown a short lead hand check to Seagal's extended forearm. Not a strike in the damaging sense. A contact that redirected the forward-moving arm while delivering a specific piece of information, which was that the space between them was being managed from Chuck's side of it, and that Seagal's access to that space was not available on Seagal's terms. Seagal came forward again with both hands open and reaching, the secondary Aikido approach for when the primary entry fails, designed to trap whatever target presents itself in the absence of the preferred target. Chuck stepped offline by 45 degrees and threw a front kick to Seagal's lead thigh. Short, controlled, calibrated at the power of a measuring strike rather than a fight-ending one. The kick that said one specific thing and said it clearly, the thing it said was this: "The distance is mine, you do not have access to it without my permission, and I am not giving permission." Clear's throat. Seagal had 2 failed entries and a clean kick to the thigh, and the information those 3 things carried was the information that the man across from him was controlling the gap between them at a precision that made the gap unavailable for the purpose the gap needed to serve for Seagal's system to function. He had been in this situation before on training floors. He had not been in it before with a man who was doing it this completely, and this economically and without any of the visible effort that Seagal's training partners had always displayed when they were attempting to manage distance against him. He committed. He dropped his weight and drove forward with his full mass behind the motion, and his arms wide and his head slightly down in the shape of a man who has decided that technique has reached its limit, and that the limit can be overcome by the application of enough forward pressure, with enough weight behind it to close the remaining distance, by force rather than by skill. Snorts. The production assistant in the doorway completed her entrance. She delivered the wardrobe question she had come in to ask. Both men answered it. The normal professional operations of a television taping resumed around the two of them, with the practical efficiency of a production that had a schedule to maintain and was going to maintain it regardless of what had occurred in the green room in the previous 48 seconds. Both men appeared on The Tonight Show that evening. Both men were professional and articulate and gave Jay Leno what a late-night interview requires from its guests, which is the performance of a recognizable version of themselves in the compressed and entertaining format that the program's structure demanded. Neither man made any reference on air to what had occurred in the green room. The audience watching the broadcast from their living rooms had no way of knowing that the 2 men sitting on the same couch on the same set had been in the same green room 40 minutes earlier, with a production assistant frozen in the doorway and a heel stopped 2 inches from a temple and 48 seconds of carpeted NBC floor between them and where they were now. The production assistant told the story to her husband that night when she got home. She told it in the specific way that people tell stories they have witnessed at close range when the stories involve things that their professional experience has not prepared them to categorize, which is carefully and with a recurring emphasis on the details that made it real for them in the moment of witnessing. For her, the detail was the coffee cup. The way Chuck had picked it up after putting the sport coat back on and looked at it and set it back down because it had gone cold. The normalcy of the gesture in the context of what had preceded it. The way the gesture communicated something about the man making it that the 48 seconds on the carpet had communicated from a different angle, which was that the 48 seconds had not been an event for him in the way it had been an event for everyone else in the room. It had been a response to a question. The question had been answered. He had returned to the coffee. The coffee was cold. He had set it down. The evening had continued. She said that the going back to the coffee was the thing she remembered most clearly, and that she had thought about it many times in the years since, and that it still seemed to her to contain something true about the difference between a man who needs the room to confirm what he knows about himself, and a man who does not need the room for that purpose because the confirmation was established a long time ago in conditions that did not include green rooms or television monitors or catering tables arranged with professional anonymity for nobody in particular. The confirmation was established on training floors and competition mats across 30 years of finding out what was true. And it turned out to be the kind of confirmation that stays confirmed regardless of what is on the catering table or how cold the coffee has gotten or what the monitor on the wall is showing while the heel stops 2 inches from the temple and the room goes quiet, and the 48 seconds complete themselves and the world continues.